Ravenser Odd appears first not as a town of stone, but as a port balanced on sand, timber and tide. Everything here depended on a fragile edge between shifting sand and controlled harbour access.
The route into the town begins where controlled entry failed. The first clear order in the port is water, quay, street, and then the town beyond.
A place like this lived by its edges, where cargo met tide and law met commerce.
Ravenser Odd rises here from port mechanics into urban life.
This was a short-lived town, but not a small ambition. It built like a place expecting permanence.
A port leaves its history in storage logic as clearly as in ships and sea walls. Counting, tying, storing, and moving, these are the verbs still preserved on the floor.
The town centre is being telegraphed already by width, height and frontage.
The market is now the spatial heart of the route, where every major choice becomes visible. A market doesn't just sell goods, it concentrates power, information, and dispute.
Ravenser Odd had the legal and commercial apparatus of a borough, and buildings like this would have embodied it.
This is the first interior that feels administrative rather than mercantile.
Even in civic rooms, the floor keeps the small scale of habit after the scale of authority is gone.
A town with customs, court and quayage would have needed rooms where paper, seals and accounts were controlled.
Administrative life survives best in tiny, durable objects that once structured much larger systems.
The hall is proving broad enough to keep orientation, even as the rooms around it grow tighter.
Records speak of court and prison at Ravenser Odd, and this room finally feels like that harder civic edge.
Even a small confinement space can retain its own object logic after the architecture is broken.
The square now works as a map. Hall behind, harbour below, church ahead.
A port borough still needed its sacred core, and it was built to dominate the civic approach.
This is the first unmistakably monumental landmark outside the market itself.
The church gives the route height and order after the clutter of port commerce.
The center of a church preserves both ritual focus and traffic through the building.
A side door matters because it ties the sacred shell back to the lived town outside it.
The town is stepping away from its church and back toward labour.
Port towns survive economically by stacking specialised labour behind the more visible frontages.
This is the first shift from town plan to tide management maze.
The lower quarter is beginning to hide direction behind function.
This is where a town built on sand begins to feel more like an engineered estuary than a borough.
Repetition is now the main threat, not collapse or scale.
The lower port is beginning to erase its own distinctions.
This is the first true Sandout of the route, and movement would only worsen it.
Retreat is safest when it follows the shape already learned.
Once a port's lower hydraulics become unreadable, the only intelligent choice is to climb back toward its larger forms. Retreat gains speed when the route passes from repetitive space into distinct landmarks.
The larger shell of the church restores order simply by being unmistakable.
A broad street is not just urban form here, it is also safety.
The square is no longer a place. It is the map of the first exploration phase. Now the borough begins dissolving again, from square to street to quay. Everything in Ravenser Odd ultimately led back toward water, because water was its opportunity and its ruin.
The return line to open water is still architectural, not guessed.
The exit is beginning to compress into the very geometry that first admitted the route.
What looked at first like a few broken edges now reads as a complete burrow on a vanishing point of sand.
A port built on sand needs to be understowed from its edges, because the edges explain everything.
What remains unentered can wait. The structure of the town is already secure in the record.
The first descent has mapped the port's outer body. The deeper civic and maritime story continues beyond this line.
The next descent begins where the port, the town, and the church briefly line up as one system.
A place like Ravenser Odd lived by controlling transition, sea outside, borough inside.
This frontage is too formal for storage alone. It likely managed traffic, dues, or inspection at the waterline.
At the waterline, commerce often turns into paperwork, law, and control.
This room feels built for transactions that needed to be witnessed, counted, and enforced.
Weights and tallies transform a waterfront room into a place of regulated exchange rather than mere storage. The wider room handled the public face. These smaller cells likely held the restricted work behind it.
Administrative rooms often survive as hardware and traces of ordering, rather than recognizably intact furniture. The density of small controlled objects confirms that this part of the waterfront handled documentation, not just goods.
The borough's deeper structure is now unfolding above the harbour rather than beside it.
If the market hall was public-facing, this structure may have held the borough's weightier decisions. The scale and formality of this room suggest a civic hierarchy deeper than trade alone. The furniture is gone, but the room still preserves status through elevation and proportion.
Important halls often hide their most controlled rooms, where only a narrow passage can reach them.
This is where civic architecture stops being spacious and starts becoming physically restrictive.
In a room this small, the route out becomes as important as anything lying on the floor. Controlled rooms preserve the most personal objects precisely because they were less trafficked and more protected.
A squeeze is only navigable once it has been reversed as cleanly as it was entered.
The deeper civic core is opening now into the borough's landward edge.
A sandspit borough had two water problems at once: seaward exposure and landward tidal instability.
This is the borough's least secure margin, where settlement gives way to shifting backwater.
Ravenser Odd's backside is even less urban and more hydraulic than its harbour face.
This is the same problem as before, only flatter. The landscape repeats until direction becomes memory alone.
The borough is now trying to erase itself into moving sand. This is the second true Sandout, and it confirms the backwater as the borough's most unstable zone.
The route out is still there, but only because the diver is giving the place time to return.
A drowned port on sand is always most dangerous where it stops pretending to be urban at all.
The safe route now is through the borough's largest, most memorable structures back to the harbour edge.
The borough's big rooms are now functioning as wayfinding anchors more than destinations.
The map is complete now. The rest of the work belongs to leaving well.
A known street is stronger than curiosity at the end of a survey.
The port returns to its simplest order now. Water first, town second.
At the end, even a complex port reduces to one final channel out.
The final exit compresses the whole borough into one ruined threshold.
Ravenser Odd now reads as a complete port organism, not a handful of disconnected ruins.
The edge is the right place to end, because the edge explains why the town existed and why it vanished.
This is Ravenser Odd as a total plan. Compact, ambitious, and fatally exposed.
Urban coherence like this is what makes the loss of Ravenser Odd feel so final. The mapping is complete enough now that distance can safely do the rest of the work.
A sand burrow disappears fastest in detail and longest in outline.
At distance, the port becomes what it always fought against, a vulnerable shape laid on shifting ground.
This is the last distance at which Ravenser Odd still reads as built environment rather than seabed pattern.
The town is almost gone from sight, which is how the sea prefers to keep its history.
What survives now is the borrower's logic, not its visibility. The survey ends when the site can no longer be responsibly read. What has been recovered here is enough to leave with.
Beyond this point, asking for more would only turn interpretation into intrusion.
The cleanest ending is the one that leaves the site undisturbed and the route fully understood.
Ravenser Odd disappears again, but this time with its plan recovered from the water. The borough has yielded its harbour, its civic core, and its fragile edges. The rest belongs to silence. The borough is not finished yet. One more edge is surfacing out of the dark. Ports on sand often grew by extension and improvisation, building outworks wherever shoreline and trade allowed. This looks like a peripheral harbour appendage, less formal than the main gate, but still unmistakably urban. This is the borough's smaller working harbour, a satellite to the main gate, but part of the same commercial body.
Peripheral harbour districts often preserve raw labour, with less monumental finish but the same commercial intensity.
This secondary square mirrors the main market in miniature, enough to organize labor, access, and exchange at the edge.
Even the outer fringe of the borough needed a place where goods became numbers.
A small port office could carry the same logic as a bigger customs house: measurement, recording, and control.
The artifact pattern is unmistakably transactional, small, dense, repetitive, and tied to counting.
Small rear spaces like this kept value dense and traffic low.
Peripheral offices may be smaller, but they can preserve sharper traces of custody than larger public rooms.
The last unexplored piece of the borough lies where service space thins into exposed edge. This is the borough's final thin line before built order gives way to shifting tidal ground. This fringe shows how abruptly Ravenser Odd could dissolve from burrow into sandwork.
This is now pure disorientation terrain. Shallow, repetitive, and unstable.
The burrow is vanishing into the same sand that once gave it ground.
This is the burrow's final refusal, and there is nothing more to gain by forcing the edge.
The final useful knowledge of this fringe is simply how to leave it. The outer harbour fringe has given up its structure. It should not be asked for more. At the end, the best route is the one already made legible by repetition.
Now the burrow is whole. Harbour front, civic core, sacred shell, work quarter, and unstable fringes.
Even its peripheral appendages preserve the same urban logic as the centre.
The site is complete enough in memory now to survive the loss of detail.
A town built on sand is remembered longest by pattern, not by mass.
This is the final distance at which Ravenser Odd still reads as a burrow rather than a seabed disturbance. The site has already given everything that can be responsibly taken from it visually. The burrow has crossed from visibility into understanding.
This is where the survey stops being a dialogue with ruins and becomes a discipline of departure. From here onward, no more information can be won without forcing the site past what it offers.
There is nothing left to ask of the darkness.
The honest end of a drowned burrow is not drama, but composure.
The last images belong not to the burrow, but to the water around it.
The place survives now as a mapped idea, rather than a visible form.
The site is gone from sight, which is exactly where restraint should win over desire.
What remains of Ravenser Odd is no longer in the light, but in the root remembered. A vanished port is sometimes best honored by how quietly one leaves it.
Nothing more should be taken from the floor once the site has already disappeared.
The final discipline is simply to keep going. The exploration has reached its most honest form: absence.
The record is complete. The scene no longer needs the site to justify itself.
The sea has taken the burrow back beyond sight.
There is no honest reason to turn back again. The last part of leaving is not discovery, but discipline.
The final image belongs to the water, not the burrow.
The town survives now only in the route already learned.
A place built on instability deserves a stable ending.
The burrow is gone from sight, but not from understanding. The sea keeps the final scale for itself.
Ravenser Odd disappears again, but this time with its structure recovered from the dark.
What remains of Ravenser Odd is now understanding rather than sight, and that is the only honest way to leave it.